Building the 1AC is one of the most important parts of debate, and you should do it thoughtfully because on the affirmative, this is the part of the debate that your debaters control. They know exactly what they're going to say. On the negative, they have to be reactive. They have to figure out what the affirmative is saying and then figure out a way to counter that. But when they are affirmative, they are in charge of the core elements of the debate, which means that you should be thoughtful about the way you put your 1AC together. Think it through. The debaters need to know it back and forth. They need to know it like the back of their hand. So it's really important, if you can do this as an entire group, to do this as an entire group and to try not to skip any steps. There are a couple of different ways to build a 1AC. The first is to go through each part as a class, debating which cards make for the very best sections and what personal voice or poetry or short story or true story of a person involved in the affirmative, or your student's relationship to the affirmative, or music you're going to add to the 1AC. And you do that as an entire class, and it's slow, and sometimes it will take a long time to do. But if you are doing this in an after school club, you might not have the same amount of time to devote to it, in which case you should break your students up into group by sections of the 1AC. And we'll talk about the sections of the 1AC later so that you understand what you're looking at. But really, you're looking at a group for inherency, a group for the first advantage, which is harms violence, and a group for the US Mexico relation harms advantage, and a group for solvency. So you have a minimum of 4 groups that you would need to break your club into. And then it is a much more expedient process to work through this. Either way, you still want to do it thoroughly, and you want each group to tell the other groups about their selections and why they made their selections. And you want to be able to put their selections up on the board, write them in, right? So you would say, okay, inherency group, what did you pick? And then you would write inherency up here, or abbreviation for it. And then you would scribble in whatever they have selected, right? And you would do that for the violence advantage, and you would do that for the US Mexico relations advantage, and you would do that for the solvency portion, right? And you would actually write it up on the board so that after every group has finished their discussion, you can fully construct your 1AC. That's the logistics of the 1AC, or how to do it in groups, but that doesn't really give you any details. So let's talk about how to do it in detail. Back the truck up, Tony. What is a 1AC? Well, a 1AC is the first affirmative constructive, and it's the very first speech in a debate, and it lays out the affirmative case for the entire debate. So basically, it's the story of what the affirmative thinks is wrong, why it thinks that wrong thing is happening, what we should do about it, and why it would work. So, why tell this story? Well, because it's the most classic story ever told. It's the story of hope. It's the story that we build our narratives of change and possibility about. It's every good movie that you've ever seen with a happy ending goes through this same process. There's a big bad thing happening in the world, and it is really big, and it is really bad. And for whatever reason, people aren't changing it. Maybe they think it's acceptable, like this is how the world should be. Maybe there are laws, so maybe like not the general population, but like those who are in control, those who govern, think that this is how the world should be, or maybe it just benefits them for it to be that way. Maybe the law is just antiquated and nobody's thought about changing it. Right? But for whatever reason, this big bad thing persists. And we should change that. And so along comes a hero or a shero, and they have a plan of action, and it's a tangible thing. It's a thing that they can understand, right? It's a specific thing. And they enact that plan of action. And then it fixes the big bad thing. It resolves it, or it mitigates it substantially. Like some of our big bad things we can't totally fix. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't at all opportunities try to reduce the power of the big bad thing, or reduce its bigness, or reduce its badness, right? And this is called solvency. And then, in our movies, we live happily ever after, or at least the movie cuts off when everybody is happy, so you think they live happily ever after. This is the story of the 1AC, and it's the way that we tell stories of change and hope and possibility, and that's why it's very, very powerful. It's a very powerful narrative. And so if it's the narrative you're telling, you know for a fact that you're on the persuasive side of the narrative, because it is the narrative that we all hope to tell. right? That's why we pass legislation. It's why we engage in revolutionary acts. It's why we protest. It's why we gather. It's why we debate. It's why we debate for the possibility that change will be successful. All right. So what you need to do is take this whole concept and fit it into an 8-minute speech that includes both evidence and your student's voice. And the evidence we have already given you to start with, and that is the starter pack. So when I'm talking about the evidence today, I'll be talking about the BAUDL Starter Pack. The voice, that's going to come from you cultivating it in your students, from you getting them to do journal writes, poetry writes, find other people's narratives that speak to the things in the starter pack, the music that they listen to, the shows that they watch, the news that they read, right? Cultivating their voice is a huge part of them feeling like this 1AC is their story of hope, their story of change, something that they can get behind and agree with. And it will make it powerful for them. All right, so what does the 1AC look like? Well, the 1AC, when it's done, will have each section divided by contention. So, contention is, well, basically as it sounds, things that you argue about, things that you contend are true. Contentions are units of argument, which means that, each card, each little piece of evidence in your packet is a contention, right? It makes a contention. It says, this is my argument. But a contention brings together several units of argument. So your students' thoughts and the evidence brings them together into one larger argument, right? So it kind of looks like this. The contention is the whole, and the pieces of evidence and your students' thoughts are its parts, right? And in this case, the sum is greater than its parts. So when you want to make an argument about whether or not police protection or improved policing in Mexico is necessary, right, that actually requires a number of smaller arguments. The contention is solvency. If we improve police in Mexico, that will counter the, drug cartels. Inside of that, though, is a number of smaller arguments, right? First, that police are closer to the community, and that's one of the reasons that it will, that improving the police fights the drug war better. Second, is that, police are trusted. They're trusted by their community, right? Which means that people are more likely, for example, to give them valuable information. Right. Third is that the people hate the military because they're a shoot first, ask questions later culture, right? And the police have better guidelines that prohibit them from doing that, which means that they're going to get more information, but they're just also more humane towards the population they're working with. Now, all three of these arguments come together to form your solvency contention. And your solvency contention can actually be 5 or 6 arguments. You choose how many you think go into it. But the point is that a contention is a unit of argument that is full of a number of smaller arguments. And those smaller arguments all come together to make a larger claim. And that larger claim is called your contention. Now we're going to look at the evidence that goes into each contention. So we know that the contention is an overall claim, and that the contention is supported with evidence and your student's voice. So we're going to look at that now. Here's a piece of BAUDL evidence, and you'll see that at the top that there is, at the very, very top, there's a header for the page that tells you which section of the file that you're in, and that gives you a general idea for what the contention would be about. Now, if you look right beneath that, you will see some empty brackets, right? There's brackets on each side of the page, but the middle is empty. This is for your tagline. A tagline is a summary of the argument you want to make. And in particular, that argument will be supported by the piece of evidence directly beneath it. So, a tagline is not a summary of the evidence. It is the argument you think the evidence makes. And you have to write it in one sentence. It should be very clear, and it should be argumentative, meaning that it should be aiming at a goal, and that goal should be the support of the plan, the support of the affirmative policy. So you'll need to write in taglines for the entire file. Your class will need to do that. Your students will need to do that. It's something that you should, monitor and pay attention to whether or not they're accurate arguments. Now, right beneath where you put the tagline, you'll notice the citation. So it will start with the author or organization and then the year, and then beneath that is the full citation. In the debate round, the students will state the tagline, they'll state the author's name and the year, but they will not state the full citation. The full citation is there so that other people can go look it up and you can verify that this evidence is accurate, that it's not taken out of context. You can use other arguments in the same article against the affirmative, so points for when you're negative. It's always good to read all of the affirmative's articles when you have them. All right. And as other people start reading new pieces of evidence, you can have your students write down the citations at the end of the debate round so that they can go look up that citation themselves, particularly if it's one that defeated them. All right. So you should go do your homework. Go check out the other team's evidence. All right. And then beneath the citation, you'll see either a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs of evidence. Now, in debate, we underline what we want to read in the debate and how you choose what to read. Well, first of all, you always include the argumentative claim of the evidence, right? So, what's the goal of this piece of evidence? What's the goal of this author's writing? Then you include their proof, right, or reasoning. So, if they say, the drug war is killing lots of people, and then they list how many people, you want to include the how many people portion because that is the data for your evidence. And then if they explain why cartels are killing people, that's the reason, and you want to include the reason. All right. And these things come together to make your piece of evidence. And then the very last part is the in your words, right? Your words portion. And that's where the students should write in their words what they think the evidence is saying. And that's different from the tagline because that's a functional summary of what they think is in the evidence or what they think is important about the evidence, not necessarily its argumentative dimension. The argumentative portion is the tagline. All right, so that's how you work your piece of evidence. That's what the starter pack is made of, and your students will need to go through and do all of these parts. They'll need to write a tagline, they'll need to underline the parts of the evidence that they're going to read in the speech, and they'll need to figure out in their own words what this piece of evidence means. All right, so now that we've looked at a piece of evidence, so you understand the tagline and the citation and the evidence, it's important that the students have a relationship to the evidence in their 1AC. So the way that the starter pack works, as you just saw, is it says in your own words at the bottom of each piece of evidence. And students don't have to insert their own words after each piece of evidence, but they're certainly encouraged to and should talk about their relationship to the piece of evidence that they have a relationship to, that they understand. The in your own words portion of the 1AC is really designed to get students thinking about what this piece of evidence means and not just regurgitating or reading. Because we don't want debate to devolve to script reading. We want students to have an understanding that is dynamic and innovative and interesting to them. And if they are talking, then they are interested. And if they're reading, they're just reading the script. They're not usually very interested in it, at least definitely not at the novice level. But I really think that's sort of true in a general sense. Now, this is why I say at the beginning of this video that you should encourage your students to find their place in the 1AC. And you should show, before you start this whole conversation, you should show 2 or 3 examples of what a 1AC looks like to your class. And there are a couple of different ways that you can do that. There are a number of videos that have 1ACs. They'll be on different topics than your 1AC, but that's good because you're building your own 1AC, so you don't want to watch somebody doing your 1AC or the students will feel inclined to just repeat what that person did. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for them to do it themselves. So it will be on different topics. You should tell them this is not on our topic, but this is a model for what we're doing, and we need to pick which model we like. So I think there are 3 categories of models. The first is your traditional 1AC. Your traditional 1AC is scripted. It really is. It's scripted for all 8 minutes. Students read it. Contention 1, inherency 1, drug cartel violence in Mexico is expanding with no sight and end. The U.S. needs a new policy strategy with Mexico if we want to save lives and restore stability to one of our closest allies. O'Neill, 2012. The most drastic shift is in the rise of violence. In 2007, there were more than just over 2,000 drug related homicides annually. By 2011, the official number escalated to more than 16,000. Violence also spread from 46 municipalities to some 225 municipalities throughout Mexico, etc. Card reading here. Right? A traditional 1AC is built like this. It's contention, tag, cite, card. We call evidences cards because they used to be on little note cards. This was, the days of debate when the evidences were very small, before we had internets and frankly, computers that could print out stuff, and photocopiers even, really. Widespread access to photocopiers. Anyways, so it looks like this, and then it just goes on like this. And there is no in your own words in a traditional 1AC. All right. The BAUDL does not work on traditional 1ACs because they are so very detached from a novice's life, and they're not as interesting for a novice. So the second type of 1AC is a voice 1AC. A voice 1AC is what students created when they were at Institute. That is where they insert themselves after they read evidence, or maybe before they read evidence, right? So the point is to have a student be able to explain to a judge what this piece of evidence means after they read the evidence. And that's a really good practice to get them to get them used to, because they are going to encounter so much evidence in policy debate that if they can think about what this means to them every time they encounter a piece of evidence, by the time they're in varsity, they'll be way ahead of the regular varsity curve. The traditionalists don't always teach that practice in a pragmatic or embedded fashion. It sort of comes later. All right, so that's what I call the voice 1AC. The third is a performance art 1AC. And like the voice 1AC, the performance art 1AC is largely based on your student's voice. But instead of just saying this is what the card means, they take those ideas and they create them into poetry. So if you have your class do, a book of poetry, poetry doesn't have to be rhyming. We're talking about spoken word here. Right? Or short stories that are related to themselves or their own experiences, right? And then you interweave those, right? So that it's like a piece of poetry from your class and then a relevant piece of evidence that's sort of related to the concept in that poetry, right? And then, a story about somebody who, lives in one of these border towns that your students found when they went looking for evidence. And then another piece of evidence about, the horrors of living in towns that have been taken over drug cartels. All right, so this is what I mean by it's interwoven. You can interweave the evidence as concepts into your poetry, right? And it really becomes a piece of performance art. And we have video example of what that looks like when hip hop debaters have done that and literally written the great bulk of their 1AC in hip hop form, right, with beats and everything. And those are things that your students are welcome to do. And this is the part where they get to really invest themselves in their 1AC, and they really like it that way. All right, so that is what it will look like when it's done. I recommend that you show some examples prior to writing the 1AC so that they know what they're aiming for. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the parts of a 1AC, and I'm going to put a handy dandy checklist up here for you, and you'll also be able to download that checklist so that you can use it as you're actually building your 1AC. But all of the 1ACs will have at least 4 parts to them. They'll have an inherency portion, which explains why the big bad thing is happening in the status quo, a plan text that tells us which policy the affirmative team thinks is the way to solve the problems of the status quo, an advantage, which is the problem that you're going to fix, and that advantage will either be about violence and human rights violations by cartels, or it will be about U.S.-Mexico relations and the U.S. for the need for the U.S. to be a global leader. And the last section is solvency, right? There'll be a solution section that proves that the plan of action actually gets the job done when it comes to this advantage that you're talking about, right? That it works. The solvency section proves that the plan works. All right, so all of the AFs will have those 4 parts. Now, you have a lot of leniency in terms of your ability to find evidence and make alterations to the inherency, to the advantage sections. You can have both advantages in your 1AC. You can only have one of them. You can change the evidence if you think that there's better evidence out there that you would like to use or that your students have found that you think they should use. And the solvency, you can find new solvency cards as long as the evidence that you find is based on or a derivative of something from the packet, meaning you can actually draw a clear link back to the packet, right? Then you're okay. Evidence is awesome. Evidence is awesome. I totally encourage you to get your students psyched about finding their own research. If they're like, well, this argument in the packet's not very good. The packet is the start line of the race, but it's not the finish line of the race. So go find a better piece of evidence that works for you. It is, and don't let them convince you that it's not out there, because it is. The drug war is a very, very big topic. Cartel violence between the US and Mexico, very, very big topic. You can't throw a rock on the internet and not hit 10 pieces of evidence about cartels. It is out there. If they want a better piece of evidence, it is definitely out there, and they can definitely find it. All right. It's just a matter of them looking and feeling empowered to look and thinking that it is awesome when they can find their own research and be their own scholars in the world. So go find it. I totally encourage it. The only thing that you cannot change is the plan text, right? Every novice debate in a BAUDL tournament will have that exact plan text in it. It is unalterable, right? Because that is the stable negative locus for debate, right? The negative knows when they walk into the room, this is what the affirmative's plan text is going to be, and so they can use that as their beginning point of attack. And it's as important to your team when you're negative as it is to other teams when they're negative, that this plan text doesn't change this year. The plan text has to stay the same. All right. So the checklist that I put up here is the checklist that you should go through as you're writing your 1AC. All right, you should, think about these things, and it's a good way to know that you have everything that you need in the 1AC. So, the top of the checklist is a thesis statement. Start your discussion of, when you're actually writing the 1AC, after you've watched some examples and explained what the concept is, start your discussion by writing the thesis on the board. The thesis is technically the plan text, because that is what the whole speech is about, right? That these problems are happening, this plan will fix it, and, the plan actually works, right? That's technically what the affirmatives AF is about. But the plan text might be a little bit wordy or a little bit cumbersome, so you can sum up the general idea of the plan text in a thesis statement. All right. Next, go to the harms. The harms are the next part to develop when you're developing a 1AC. And the reason the harms are the next place to develop is because students are really good at understanding and identifying problems and their ability to discuss those problems. So start with the problems of the war on drugs, right? What problem is it that compels the affirmative team or the advocate to support this thesis statement, right? Like, why is this what we are going to talk about? What problems bring us to talking about this, right? And then list all the harms that they talk about up on the board. All the harms. It could be drug addiction. It could be cartel violence. It could be that, it's expensive. It could be all sorts of things. I mean, students are really very perceptive about the harms of the drug war. And, we can list tons of them. Anyways, put them all up on the board. List them all. Now, start looking for cards in your starter packet that relate to those harms that they listed on the board. All right. And, you can break your class up into groups, and you can say, okay, you're going to look in the violence cards, and you're going to look in the Mexico relations cards, and, however you want to do it. Or you can, have each student read a card, depending on how many students you have. All right. Find evidence that backs up the things that your students think are the problem when it comes to the U.S. and Mexico's drug war. Remember, it's not just the U.S. drug war, it's the U.S. and Mexico's drug war, right? So it's the relationship between. All right. And there's a suggested video for you to watch in the activities guide that I think is actually a pretty good idea. All right. So you might want to do that before you talk about what the problems are. Anyways, they'll have a good idea of the problems of the drug war all on their own. So now you're going to start to find evidence. All right. Discuss each possible card. Pick the very best ones argumentatively. What is the most compelling evidence? Which one compels you logically? Which ones compel you emotionally? Which ones have the most reasons in them or data in them, right? come up with ways to determine which pieces of evidence are better than others, and then structure that evidence into a contention. So take 2 or 3 pieces of evidence that explain the whole of the problem and call that a contention. And that contention will later become your advantage because the plan is going to fix this problem. All right. Next, point of the checklist number 3, find inherency. Explain why the problem is happening. Now that we know what the problem is, why is it happening? Like, why does this continue? All right. So, ask the students why the problem is happening. Is it happening because of the government? Is it happening because of people's attitudes? Is it happening because we just don't know? Are we really just ignorant? All right. List what they think are the reasons for the problem up on the board. Then go through the inherency card and find 1, at most 2 pieces of evidence that explain why the problem is happening, right? And then again, debate back and forth which piece of evidence is the better evidence of the choices available to you from the starter pack. All right, next part on the checklist, part number 4, discuss the plan of action. So if you did not use the exact plan as the thesis, right, you just use a summary, now you're going to actually write the plan up on the board. What is the plan? What does it mean? Like, what does this sentence mean? Take it apart and have students talk about what they think each portion of the plan means. And if necessary, you might need to assign them some homework on the Merida initiative so that they actually go and research it, know what's happening on it. All right. That's the plan text that's in all the affirmatives. So if they have an understanding of it, other affirmative teams might explain it differently, but the words will be the same. So it's good for them to be able to talk about what the words mean. All right, last part of the checklist, proving the plan works. So now ask the students, why do they think this plan would actually fix these problems that we already talked about, that we found evidence on? How does it address this actual problem? And then write their reasons up on the board. Now go back to the cards and do the same thing. In the solvency section, find the pieces of evidence that best match your students' reasoning, right? Maybe they provide some new reasoning, things that the students hadn't thought about before. And again, debate which card is best. In the end, you're actually going to now have selected all of the evidence for your 1AC. So let's talk about what you do after you have all the evidence picked. All right, so now that you have the evidence picked, you need to actually form it into a 1AC. So what I have here is a piece of team paper, right? I recommend that you make your own debate paper for your team because it creates huge team unity, right? So this has the Wallenberg Bulldogs on it because that's the team paper I worked on most recently, and then it has the Bay Area Urban Debate League over here on the side, right? I just put this in the header up here. It's no big deal. All right, so I've picked my pieces of evidence, and now I have my team paper, and pass out, 8 to 10 sheets of team paper per team so that there's some space. And the card that you pick to be inherency, we're going to start with contention 1 inherency because we always start with why the problem exists before we discuss the problem. So, contention 1 inherency. Now, I take the little piece of paper from the packet. All right, so here is my packet evidence. And for this section, you're going to need scissors, tape, and team paper. All right, and I literally cut the piece of evidence out. So what I do is I cut the portion that is the citation, right? So O'Neill 2012, and I cut around the evidence. So I cut the entire piece of evidence into a little square. All right. When I'm done, it looks like this. Now you can see why we used to call them cards. These used to fit on note cards. All right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write on my piece of paper here, I'm going to write contention 1 inherency. All right. Now I'm going to write my tagline next, right? Because your students are developing taglines. So a tagline is an argumentative summary of the evidence. So it takes what the evidence is trying to say and it turns it into a debate argument. But it's one sentence. It's one sentence, and it should be a clear argument. And the evidence should support that argument. So, for example, your evidence might be, the U.S.-Mexico drug war. It might say that the military is too heavily involved. And so your tagline would be like, U.S.-Mexican drug war over-focused on the military, right? Is over-focused on the military. All right, so you want a complete sentence up there, and that's your tagline. Then you take the evidence, So your tagline is here, right? You have the student's hand right in their tagline. You take the evidence and you tape it, right? So this is the tape portion. You tape it to the piece of paper, all right? And then you do another tagline down here and you tape another piece of evidence. And we call this writing the 1AC, writing the 1AC. Now, possibly you don't want to put more than one piece of evidence per page because you want the students to be able to write in their own voice. And if you're doing a performative 1AC, which is, by the way, so fantastic when it's done well and when your students put time and effort into it. And frankly, learning, remember that learning is part of the process. So even if it's like not the best piece of performance art you've ever seen, or maybe it's even mildly terrible, if they care about it and they're invested in it and they want to say it, let them do it. Let them do it. It's really important. It's, we learn by trial and error. And frankly, it's the error part that we learn the most from, right? So down here would be the space for in their own words, or poetry, or the narrative that they're interested in, or the metaphor that they think better explains their argument, or their own understanding of the evidence. All right. And these are your team briefs. And so when you finish, you'll have 8 to 10 pages of 1AC, and that will be your 1AC for the team for the first tournament. And you can always go back and fix it. You can decide, hey, this 1AC doesn't get us argumentatively what we want. Maybe we didn't pick the best piece of evidence. We thought this was good evidence, but our judges are saying it's not. Or, we don't think it's a good piece of evidence now that we're actually using the 1AC, right? Or, hey, we need more of our voice in here. There's not enough of our voice in here. We're just doing too much reading of the 1AC, right? Does that make sense? You can go back and make alterations later. But that is basically what it looks like when it's done. You will need to tag the entire file. You will need to tag the entire file. So nothing in the file has any taglines on it. You are going to have students sit down in groups and tag each of the cards, and then have the group share with each other the taglines, or you can have them turn the taglines into you and you can review them. This is a good place for you to do some grading to see if they understand the arguments that the cards should be used for. But you need to make sure that the entire file is tagged before the first tournament. I wouldn't worry about that as you're building the 1AC. As you're building the 1AC, you want them to tag all of the evidence that's in the inherency, all of the evidence that's in the harms, which are the violence and U.S.-Mexico relations, and all of the evidence in the solvency. And you need them to tag those things because you need to be able to pick which ones are the best. And you might as well have them tag while they're reading the evidence and making the choices, that we talked about earlier, because then they won't have to go back and do it again later. And, it saves you some time. You can always change your tags just like you can always change any part of your 1AC. All right, so working on the student relationship to the 1AC. It is important that students feel a relationship to their 1AC. They are the advocate for this plan of action. So that means that to some extent, they should believe that it is viable. They should believe that it is a good idea. And they should be willing to be invested in it. In order to cultivate that relationship, there are some things that you can do as an instructor. First, you can show some topic-oriented examples, right? So these things help spark student inspiration. You can find music on the drug war. You can find poetry like deaf poets, or, poetry in a general sense. Spoken word. There's a lot of really great spoken word competitions out there that help spark inspiration. You can find stories like first-person accounts, right? Real accounts of people who are living the drug war, if you will, and you can find it from different sides. You can find, lots of great music on the drug war. And, you don't have to find all of those things. You can just find one or two, show them to the students, and then assign them to bring in their own example, and then have everybody share. These things will help spark some inspiration. You can have them do a free write on the war on drugs. One of the better ones that I saw at Institute was to use the 5 senses to free write, right? How does the war on drugs taste, smell, touch, hear, and see, right? when you think about these senses, what do you think about it? You can have them write about their relationships to the war on drugs. Maybe they don't have any, but most of us at some point do have a relationship to the war on drugs in some fashion. Um, and then you can figure out what the themes are and build your affirmative case around those themes, or you can include those, poignant free writes into the 1AC. You can let students add their own in, so everybody can have a slightly different 1AC at your school based on their own perspective or feelings, or free write, or if they liked poetry, or if they like music, or if they liked art, right? And maybe they have an artistic interpretation of it. Anyways, there's a great degree of freedom there in terms of working on the student relationship, but you'll need to cultivate that relationship. And of course, having them explain the evidence in their own language is a great way to start that relationship, and you should definitely do that to make sure that they understand what relationship they're trying to talk about, that is actually embedded in the evidence portion of debate, because evidence is important, but evidence takes a couple of different forms, right? And their own personal testimony, their own experiences are a form of evidence. In debate, though, that stuff has the ability to be contested. It has the ability to be contested. If you put it into a debate round, the negative team gets to say no. And I think all debaters need to know that, particularly if they're going to say something that is really personal and really meaningful to them, that when it enters the space of debate, it enters the space of argument. And so debate is a great channel for saying, this is what I know in the world. But debate means that what you know in the world gets contested. The negative team has the right, arguably the duty, to test those concepts and experiences, to challenge them, right? And if we are really interested in making the world a better place, then we have to be interested in our arguments being challenged, our ideas being challenged, because the best idea does not come from a series of heads nodding yes. The best idea comes from working hard. It comes from challenge. It comes from thoughtfulness, right? It comes from reflection, and it comes from alteration. And so, in debate, the long vision of debate, what we're really hoping for over the course of this year is that students do that they hash through ideas, that they change their 1ACs many times over the course of the season, so that they can get by the end of the season to the idea that they have real belief in, that they feel has been tested, that they feel is defendable. That's our goal, that's our hope. And that's what makes young scholars. Right. And I'm really excited to watch what your young scholars do in rounds. And I know that you're going to be excited too, because you'll get to judge other teams' young scholars and see what ideas that they came up with from this very same concept. So good luck. See, and tagged all of your affirmative evidence, it's time to file your evidence. So we have given you these expandos so that each student can carry a file of their own. You should make sure that they file appropriately. Divide up the starter pack into its various parts. So the 1AC is in the first pocket, and then the second pocket is extension evidence for the case, like solvency, inherency, and harms. The third is like your answers to counterplan. The fourth, your answers to disadd. And the fifth, your answers to case attacks. The rest of the file will get used for your negative. Make sure that you put an index on the front so that everybody can find everything easy. This video has been about the role of the coach, and in particular, the role of the coach in guiding how to put together the affirmative speech so that your students can be advocates that are deeply connected to their debate arguments. Because if they are connected to their debate arguments, then those words will be valuable to them. And given how much time your students spend on debate and you spend on debate, we want their words to be valuable. We want their words to be meaningful. We want them to care and be invested as advocates. So hopefully now you feel like you have the tools to take the starter kit, to connect it to your students, and to help them become advocates. In the next set of videos, we'll talk about how to deal with putting together the negative. So we'll do the starter kit stuff for the negative. You are the key part to the student success at your school. So be inspiring, be their leaders, be yourself. BAUDL fight, BAUDL win.